Hello, my name is Jamie Younger. Welcome to the Story Keep podcast, Who We Remember. On this show, I speak with a wide variety of guests about one family member's life story that they would love to have documented on film. Whether the person is living or now deceased, we explore their spirit and share some of their incredible life stories and surprising histories. Most of us think way too late about capturing the stories of our loved ones. These conversations on this show elevate and honor and speak to that one person's lasting influence. I promise that you will walk away feeling empowered and moved and hopefully inspired anew to think about your life and the impact that you want to make. Today, I'm joined by Tom McCullough, the chairman, CEO, and co-founder of Northwood Family Office, the leading multifamily office in Canada. His life and story is intertwined with the extraordinary life of his dad, Fred McCullough. Tom's father, Fred, was a remarkable person. He came from very humble beginnings. He was the 8th child in a family of 11 on a poor farm, and Fred only completed grade 9 education, but he rose to become a successful businessman and entrepreneur. Before we fully delve into Fred McCullough's story, let me introduce you more fully to his son and my guest, Tom. Tom McCullough is a renowned figure in the field of wealth management with a distinguished career as an author, educator, and thought leader. His insights and contributions have shaped the industry, and he's earned some incredible accolades, including Best Individual Contribution to Thought Leadership in the Wealth Management Industry for North America from 2020 out of the Family Wealth Report Awards. I'm really looking forward to introducing you to Tom in this new way and the special relationship that he had with his father, Fred. Tom, thank you so much for making this time to talk with me about your dad.
My pleasure. Look forward to it.
Yeah. So I'd love to just start off having you tell me and tell our listeners, out of the many people that you could select as the life story that you would want to have documented, why your dad?
He comes to mind all the time in decisions I make, and he passed away in 2020, but still comes to mind in things that are funny, things that decisions I make, interactions with the rest of my family. He's still sort of active in the family, so it was a very logical person from the first person that came to mind. So he lives large in our family, even though he was a very humble person.
Yeah. So his name is Fred. Did he go by Fred or another nickname, or?
He went by Fred. His name is Frederick Thomas McCullough, and my name is Frederick Thomas McCullough, but I go by Tom. He went by Fred.
Yeah. I was intrigued to hear that he was one of 11 kids in his own family. My mom and my dad came from families of 8 and 9, so I could appreciate that. What did he tell you about that, about growing up as one of 11, or and number 8, I think?
Yeah, number 8. He had dozens and dozens of stories. I won't tell them all, but it was a poor farm family in near Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. But it was a rural farm family. Everybody asks if they were Catholic because there were so many kids. They weren't. They were actually Protestant. But and I would say it was not a successful farm family, from a money standpoint at all. They were very poor. There's just the classic story. I don't know if this is just poverty, but 11 kids and one bath water. They'd fill it up and they'd start with the youngest and work their way up. I think they might have changed the water for the teenagers, but at some point, anyway, the water got cold and probably dirty. And they never really. They were always poor. They were always right on the edge. One day, my dad was out with his brother and they were walking along and they stepped on a pound of butter in the field. And then so they looked around, and then there was another grocery item, maybe some flour or something. And so they thought it was manna from heaven. They gathered all this stuff and brought it home and, ate some of it. And anyway, the police came around later, and I guess somebody had robbed the store and ran from the police and dropped all this stuff. So they had to give back all the things that they hadn't eaten yet. I guess they wish they'd eaten it faster, but so that kind of thing was a really big deal because they were really so poor.
What kind of farming was it? And did he? I guess he definitely participated in the farming life.
Oh yeah, everybody did. It was I think it was sustenance farming. I know they had eggs, they had chickens, and took eggs into town to sell them, and they had some crops, and they had some horses, but I think they were mostly working horses. One point they cut my dad and one of his brothers cut the horse's tail off, the hair on it, and sold it to somebody who came by for a bushel of apples. And his father was furious, but also the apples were very nice on the top, but completely rotten down below. So but that horse hair would have been worth a lot of money. And also, my grandfather was apparently very embarrassed to be, plowing the fields with horses with no tails.
And how do you imagine, I mean, just from the kind of person that your dad ended up being, how being one of 11 influenced him? How was he?
Mm-hmm. There were, just for context, there were four boys. One of them died at 3 years old. That affected my dad quite a lot, even into his adult life. It was the child that was closest to him, and he died of some kind of twisted bowel or something that today probably would have been quite solvable. So it's my dad always really felt terrible about that. But it was a very matriarchal home. All these sisters, and he was young, so he had a lot of mothers. But ended up staying close to his family over all the years. So there was 10 of them that were that lived into adulthood. And but actually, one of the things that comes to mind about living with that many kids is that he only had 2 grandchildren, my 2 kids, and he was always sad when they had to go to bed alone. They had to sleep in their bed alone because it just seemed so lonely for them, because he always had like 2 other siblings in a bed. It was a very small house. I've seen the house that they lived in. It was a very small farmhouse for 13 people. And so he was, he's used to lots of activity. He was very precocious, and I don't know. We never know if it was him or his brother that locked their mother in the not the outhouse, but some outbuilding. They locked her in there all day, and she was a tough lady, so they were in big trouble. But he was a real jokester. Like he into his life. I would say if people think of my dad, people who knew him well, they would think of his laugh. He had a very loud, infectious laugh, laughed easily, and played jokes on people all the time. And I think that came from just being in a family with, we also joke about him having his only toys were a rope and a stick. They didn't have anything, so they just made do with what they had, which is a skill.
Yeah, for sure. And he, if I remember correctly, when we spoke before, he made a kind of big transition in his life from his first career to his second. What did he do as his first career? I forget now.
Well, career is a bit of a stretch, I would say. He was he worked at a butcher shop for a while, and by the way, somebody tied a pig's tail, like a real live pig's tail, to the back of his coat, and he took the streetcar home with this on. So that was very much part of their life at that age and stage. I know he worked in a funeral home at one point. He did end up working in a bank, Bank of Toronto, which some of your listeners on the West Coast or the East Coast of the U.S. will have heard of TD Bank or Toronto Dominion Bank. But those banks merged in the Toronto Bank of Toronto and the Dominion Bank merged in Canada in 1955. So this is before that, and he worked for the Bank of Toronto. So that's how long ago it was. But he had grade 9 education, so he really left school to work on the farm and bring, contribute to the family income because it was challenging. But then he started a printing business as an entrepreneur with some other partners. And it went okay, but not great. They ended up selling it to an American company, but didn't make a ton of money. And then in the interim, to make ends meet before he figured out what he was going to do, they started a coin laundry, a laundromat to make money. And I remember myself and my parents and my grandmother sitting around the kitchen table once a week, counting coins and rolling coins from these machines where people would wash and dry their clothes. And he also delivered.
That was what he was doing when you were a young kid. They were running the laundromat. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and that wasn't a full-time job. And then it was, and then they also delivered rental typewriters. So think back in the day, if you wanted a typewriter to type a paper, if you were a student or type some kind of letter, and you couldn't afford to buy one, you would rent one, if you can believe it. So my parents would deliver these rental typewriters. If you really had an extra couple of bucks, you could get an electric one versus a standard one. And so I remember being in the back of the car, pouring rain, and my dad, driving around and delivering these typewriters to people. But then at some point he decided that he wanted to, I don't know what his process was, but he wanted to be in industrial real estate sales. So buying or selling buildings, factories. And it's a very interesting story. He was 40 at the time, and he went to the main company that does this, and they said, "You're too old." Back in the day when I guess you could say that. But at 40, he was too old. And also didn't have education, although I'm not sure how important that was for that business per se. He was a very business-oriented guy. And my dad said to the person who was interviewing him, he said, "I'm going to be the top salesman in my first year. I'm going to give you one more chance to hire me." And the guy did hire him, and he was. So there's a guy with grade 9 education with, this very sort of checkered past of, not checkered, but, not coming off multiple successes. And He became very successful at that and ended up buying and owning buildings himself. And that's where he made his wealth. And he ended up being extremely financially successful. So,
wow.
He always used to answer the phone at home, if you can believe it. This is Fred McCullough, heir to the McCullough millions. Well, he wasn't heir to anything. He was there to debt, if anything at all. But he would do that, and people would never quite know how to respond to that.
It was like, that's a good way to start.
I know. Where do you go from there? Exactly.
And like looking back, I don't know if I asked you if you have any, recordings of him at all. But if you could go back and ask him now questions about sort of that era of his life, like you said, I don't really know how he kind of came to the idea of going into that sort of business. Any questions you might have for him, like about his life path?
Well, one thing I can say, I know that he didn't want to be poor. He'd been poor, been there, done that, didn't like it. And so it was, he was motivated to make money. He was an entrepreneur. He was an entrepreneurial person. He was always looking for opportunity. But he wasn't he ended up being in that industrial real estate business for the rest of his life. So that was 40 to 65, and, became very successful at it. So he didn't jump around, but, I think, and we haven't really talked about this, but this was a family of faith as well. So a fairly rigid faith, I would say, sort of, Quaker type, background. So very, I was going to say frugal, but partly because they had to be, but, there was rules, and, there was, requirements for tithing and, being faithful and doing the right thing. That was all built in. And he took all that and was actually not part of that group, but certainly had a faith and a religious practice and an intent of goodness all his life. They were the most hospitable people I know, ever. My parents, everybody, I can't tell you the number of people who I'll meet and say, "Oh yeah, I stayed at your house. Your parents we were living somewhere else, I stayed at your parents' place. I mean, and the other thing they'd be known for is their marriage. They had the best marriage I've ever come across. And it's, takes two. And I think, I don't know if I give more credit to one than the other. I think probably both of them, but just, so all of his background ended up, like all of us, ended up forming the person he was. And yet in all of that, he was a very quiet, sort of, leader in some ways, but not, my parents were very, very together. Everything they did was together. And one didn't really dominate the other, just because of the age and era. My dad, as the man, was, I suppose, a little bit more out front, but not much. They were very, very together couple. And my dad had a very tender heart. And so, I don't know, I suppose we're going to talk about this later, but lots of those things by osmosis seep into your own soul and, form who you are. And so going back to, I think he would have thought that he had a very difficult life growing up. And I think he would have felt very privileged in the second half of his life to have found some financial success and happy marriage and a fantastic son. Just kidding.
100%. But speaking to that, what qualities in particular have you taken on and maybe tried to take on?
Yeah.
Your dad.
Yeah. Yeah. And he was never the kind of person that sat me down and said, you need to do this and you need to be this. That expression, values are caught, not taught. That definitely applied in their case. They were very, they didn't have an agenda that I had to follow. Their view was, do what you can, do the best you can. We'll support you. That was sort of the view. And, so, actually one of the things that comes to mind is humor. There was lots and lots of laughing in our family. At my dad's, memorial, he died in 2020. My daughter, Kate, talked about him, being a laugher. He was just, when you think of my dad, my grandpa, I think of him laughing. My dad laughs like crazy, and I do. And so humor is a very, very big part of who we are. My dad would play pranks on people too. I think I mentioned that, but honestly, he would do terrible things. Like I'd have a friend over and my dad would be stirring his coffee and he'd touch the hot spoon to the kid's leg. And the kid would, bang on the table and everybody would laugh. And, or he would throw a plastic spider against the somebody's window and it would sort of, wander down. Oh my gosh. So I'm not making up the humor part. It was definitely a big part of it. And his family, his sisters were all laughers. Like if you go to that family, they would be laughing constantly. So I'd say that's one. And another one that comes to mind immediately is tenderness. He couldn't watch, anything on television or real life that was, somebody was being harmed, particularly children, animal. He wasn't really an animal person in a big way, but couldn't watch anything being harmed. And this is not this is just a small example of it, but yeah, we have a family cottage on the lake, a couple of hours north of Toronto, and where I live. And at Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving, which is October, it's usually cold, but every year my daughter would jump in the lake in October. And so one time it was cold and I said, I'll give you $10. I'll give you $2 if you jump in the lake. And my dad offered to give her $10 not to have to jump in the lake because he was saying, oh, it's too cold. You don't want to jump in the lake. So very, very tender guy. And I think maybe the other thing I'd say is hospitable. And so all of those things are me now. It's just we become our parents in some ways, bad ways too, I'm sure, but hopefully in lots of good ways. And they're extremely, extremely generous people. And so I aspire to that and hopefully practice some of that in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about how your dad grew up and the humor, I it just came to my mind in reading Viktor Frankl's book about meaning. I'm forgetting the exact title now, but that search for meaning, man's search for meaning. That so many parts of sort of Jewish life has been so difficult, and humor has been the anecdote to that. And I mean, it sounds like he and his siblings grew up in this difficult situation in a lot of ways, and they, humor was, sustaining to a certain degree. But it's continued, even though it sounds like you live an easier life in many ways than he and his siblings did, but still humor stays.
Yeah, it ends up being part of the culture. It's the way we relate, and as a family, and yeah, it's. I mean, a good day for me is when I have laughed uncontrollably, and it doesn't happen all the time, doesn't happen often, but sometimes you just get beyond yourself, and I think to myself, wow, I really like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Was so many times with couples, there's sort of the straight man, so to speak, and the other one who's constantly doing the jokes. Was that dynamic happening with your mom and dad, or what role did she play with the humor?
Oh yeah. My dad was the funnier person, but my mom, was not sour. She was great.
Yeah.
And enjoyed his jokes. I mean, she heard the same joke 50 times because he'd tell it to lots of different people, and she laughed each time. So she was very, very gracious. They were just such a great couple in sync. They were just amazing. They did things together. I had couple friends. They were, everybody who knew them thought about them as the best marriage they know. And so they were just really, really in sync. And I think it's unique. I don't think it's common at all. I think most of us are normal, and they were abnormal a little bit in some ways. So
If you had the
yeah.
chance to ask him about any part of that, you know about the marriage and what made it work, I mean, do you feel like you took it in and understood it, or do you feel like you would still have kind of a lingering question if you could now to ask him?
I do wonder if my mom was the drive was the I think my mom liked peace and let a lot of things go early on, and I think my dad got into that groove.
Mhm.
And so, I think with a different person, he might have been maybe more combative. So I think she probably set the tone, and he thought, "This is good. Let's go with that." That's my guess. I don't really know. They didn't really talk about it a lot. We didn't sort of dissect the family very much, and I was an only child. I don't know if that's come up yet, but that's but that they I know they had a couple of miscarriages, so they had planned to have more kids, but couldn't, and so that was quite a different dynamic coming from, a family of 11 on my dad's side. My mom's one of three, and there's three sisters, and they stayed very close all the way along. They were our crowd for Christmas and birthday parties and so on, and they were extremely close as sisters. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know what I would ask them now going back, but it was, but you can certainly tell, and other people knew as well that was,
Mm.
they were.
And do you feel like you take a leaf out of that book of kind of like letting things go in your own?
Oh, I, I'm sure it was. I wish I was that kind of person. I'm high. I'm kind of wound tight, So I don't think either of my parents really were. So that's an interesting one. I got into business early. I was with an investment bank, early on in my career. I've been an entrepreneur, started a business 21 years ago, and push, 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 and it's I'm not a relaxed person, and that's I'd like to be more. I don't know if my parents were relaxed, but they were. certainly easy to get along with, and I'm less so, for sure.
I beg to differ, but I don't know you well enough.
Oh no! Oh no! 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 I have multiple personas like we all do.
Indeed.
But I'm I'm more highly strung than I'd like to be, and I think that that's a goal, let's say.
Well, that sort of dovetails in a question I had about what part of who your dad was and his impact on you and hopefully his legacy. What part of that do you feel like you still want to live out that's not quite in its fullest expression yet? That you feel like I still want to do this in a way to, I don't know, take on those qualities that I respect about him.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I think about him all the time is his humility, and he was respected and a quiet leader and a solid friend, and like, what's wrong with that? Like, if that's all if that's all we are, that's pretty darn good. And and if we can raise some decent kids who try and do similarly, like, it's good. And so I in the business world, and certainly as an entrepreneur, there's a lot of drive and push and so on. And I think my dad seemed to find the balance somehow. He would, in the early days of the industrial, when he was selling industrial buildings, you might do 1 or 2 sales a year and make all the money for the year, or you might make 0 sales, but they were huge. If you made them, it was, 1 sale could be easily enough money for your whole year. And so we talked about business around the dinner table every night. What deal's happening? When might it close? Will it? What does it need? Et cetera, et cetera. So, I feel like somehow he found good balance. And, nobody talked about work-life balance back in the day, but I think he found it. And, I'm not as good at that. I aspire to that in my years to come, maybe. But so that's something that is in my mind. That and his really his humility, and those are things that I always have as sort of beacons. And I don't know how good a judge we are about ourselves, but I know he was a model for me in those ways, and I haven't always followed it, but it's always out there as a thought that my dad was that kind of person, and I was very proud of him. Like, he was not the kind of person who people would put up their picture and say this person led many and was CEO of this. He's a very, very humble guy. He would not have thought a lot of himself, that he was anything special. But and so I've probably achieved more notoriety than he did, but he was a beautiful, humble person, and I aspire to that.
You've had a few years now without him, and I don't know if you had a chance to spend time with him near the end, or what that was like for you, but I'm curious if you could say anything to him now, with some of the years that have passed. What would you want to say to him?
Well, let me back up and give some context. He had dementia. It came on not early in life, so apparently it's not predictive. Who knows? But so if you talk to people who have dementia, people with dementia in their life, people say you lose them slowly. So by the time my dad passed away, I had lost a lot of him already. So it was a slow process of loss, And so, and they also say that dementia is like Swiss cheese. You know, if you poke it, sometimes you hit cheese and sometimes you hit a hole, but you never know quite when that's what you're going to hit. And then my mom ended up with dementia later. That was a sort of quite a surprise because she was always I don't know, we just never thought that would happen. So both of them had dementia and were in the same retirement home because we, you know, obviously we could not care for them. And it was so sweet, you know, we'd come and see them and the two of them would be sitting together on the couch, arm in arm for, you know, a good chunk of their life and a good chunk of their later life. And, you know, this is one of those classic sad stories of COVID, but my dad, we believe, died of COVID in the very, very early days in the retirement home, and we could not be there. So it was, you know, one of those things, everything was an emergency. You didn't know what you could do. You certainly couldn't go there. You know, so it was very, very, very sad. And we didn't have a funeral because it was in the depths, like in the very beginning of COVID. So we did have a family reunion on my dad's side of the family at our cottage when last July. There was 65 people there. And two of the siblings had passed away during COVID. And we did a bit of a memorial at that. So there was something that was, so I felt like, but I just thought, you know, wow, all the people that my dad has influenced, there's 28 first cousins. And because my dad was near the bottom of the family lineup, they were closer to the cousins than some of the older people, and they were a little bit more they're a little less rigid or less traditional, say, in their faith, so they were a little freer. And so there's a great love between those 28 first cousins and my parents. So anyway, that's a long-winded context, but your question really is about, you know, what would I say to my dad today? And it's funny, just the things that go in your memory when you have dementia. My dad would ask me, you know, the same question 10 times when we met together. But one of the things we stumbled upon is looking at old pictures, and my dad knew poems. And so I would say the first line of the poem and he would say the second line of the poem. And we would go through these poems and he knew the words of the poems. He didn't know what he had for lunch, but he knew the words of the poems. He's, you know, beautiful things. And so I don't know, that's a real significant memory. But what would I say to him? I would thank him for being a wonderful dad. I would thank him for his model of humility, hospitality, generosity, love of my mother, kindness, grace. And those are pretty good things to emulate.
It's been a total pleasure talking, Tom. I really enjoyed learning about your dad. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking about him, and you know, how often do we do this? Not very often. Not in this kind of, you know, intentional way. You know, somebody might mention something about him. We'll have a 1 second reference, but I haven't sort of sat down and thought about him for a long time like this. So it's a gift to me as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure.